I'm very excited to be here. As I was talking earlier, I was telling Kim that I have had a previous life that started in the Bay Area. I went to Berkeley from 86 to 88 to get a master's in engineering. And I got a master's in industrial engineering and operations research. I'm just giving you a little background so it sort of will be more interesting maybe, or contextualize the work in an interesting manner. I got a master's in engineering, worked for Texas Instruments for 5 years, then I quit my job, went back to art school, got a bachelor's emeritus in Yale, and then MFA from UCLA. I guess my point of bringing that up for me was that I came to art later in life, and I always made pictures since my earliest memories have been about making drawings, doodling, making pictures, paintings of boats and ships and jewelry. And I remember this idea of connecting things. I was very interested in seeing how connections happen, both physically, structurally, emotionally, spiritually, I guess. So I remember my earliest drawings were looking at someone's earrings and trying to figure out how the two rings fit together, and how many rings I could keep adding to make this elaborate sort of, geometry. What started to happen was I started working as an engineer, and I pretty much knew at that point that I was not going to be happy as an engineer working in corporate America. I started taking art classes at a community college in the evenings, and it became, at that point, clear that when I made art, I was most vitally connected as a human being. I also got a lot of support from my teachers, which gave me the courage to kind of quit my job and go back to school. So before I begin, I want to just read out a little paragraph from a book called The Sea Change by H. Stuart Hughes. It sort of maybe will lay the sort of mood or the temperature for what I'm trying to say or what I'm trying to do in my work. Aesthetics, ethics, metaphysics. These matters of value, Wittgenstein agreed, lay in the realm of the unutterable. But it was natural and inevitable that men should speak of them, and much could be learned from the way in which people went about their foredoomed task of trying to say the unsayable. Moreover, it would not be clear where the boundary of sanctioned speech lay until an attempt had been made to cross it, and that attempt had failed. Such efforts Wittgenstein regarded with benevolence. He treated them as reconnaissance expeditions, perilous to be sure, but well worth the effort expended on them. My work, what I decided I'm going to do is show you work from my second show out of graduate school from 2002 at Margot Levin Gallery in Los Angeles. All through graduate school, I was making works on paper. They were basically drawings. I used myself, my body, as a ready-made or found object, and I just deployed it into space. It was like atoms, molecules, particles that were populating the space for all kinds of purposes. And it was an extremely liberating experience for me because I was interested in creating experiences for the viewer, but I was looking for subject matter at that time or looking for some sort of cultural information, and I found myself, and I went back to myself, and I decided I'm just going to use myself as subject model. So I was making these, started out small drawings, much in the tradition of miniatures, actually. Rendered drawings of me floating, tumbling, hurtling, swimming, dancing through space. And that went on for a while. They were not, I would say, autobiographical. They were more personal. They were more dreamlike. They were about another kind of world. So this piece, this show actually comes out of that body of work. I started to feel that as I was making those miniature paintings, drawings, I became that Indian guy who made the miniatures. It sort of started to get essentialized in that way. There was this very interesting othering that started to happen, and it made me resist that. And I started to think about my relationship to minimalism, to pop art, to spiritual abstraction, to Bollywood posters. So it started to sort of, I really wanted to bring into play all the complex sources of influence and information that had been my life up to that point. So The drawings got bigger. They became more painterly in scale. I started to get really interested in the idea of the relationship of the work to architecture. So I was sort of interested in how the paintings or drawings functioned as objects, but also as space. I started to think about, at that point, a lot was going on with music for me, because I have been trained as a musician. I play the tabla and the piano, and so I have had this interest and influence of music in my life. So I was invited to do my second show at Margo Levin in Los Angeles. It's a pretty large, daunting space, and I wanted to make something that was going to utilize the space in a way that was poetic and musical. At the time, I'm just going to start playing the tape. It's an 8-minute long DVD, and then I have still images, I think. Where are we? Is the projector on? Ah, there it is. This is probably going to be the hardest one to see because they were monochrome. It was a drawing that was 110 feet long that wrapped around the entire space. And the inspiration for this piece was actually music that I was listening to at the time. There were 2 tracks that I would play repeatedly. There was a Daft Punk song and a Macy Gray song. And these were really very particular to my life at the time. The Daft Punk song had really upbeat lyrics, really positive and happy and really melancholic sort of melody. And then the Macy Gray was completely the flip. And it was really interesting for me to see how those sort of contradictory, paradoxical emotions coexisted. Because there was no differentiating when I was listening to the music. I couldn't tell. So I photographed myself, and then I started making these drawings, or paintings, if you will, where I scribed myself with a sharp object. And these are like relief drawings, so they're etched into a material called duraline. It's like a plastic. So they're painted on one side, etched on both sides, and drawn on one side. In this first panel that you're seeing, there's no drawing with pigment. It's just an etching that's creating the sort of relief embossed volume. So the other thing that I was also thinking about a lot at the time was the idea of hybridity, not just as a cultural notion, but literally trying to make something that was really hybrid. And I was thinking about drawing, painting, relief sculpture, installation, cinema, environment. So I kept, again, that sort of, I think the tendency for me was one of escaping essentializing myself as a subject, maybe. And so every time I felt like there was a genre or a medium that kind of locked me down, I felt like I had to sort of push out. And so I kind of literally kept trying to push for myself the boundaries of where drawing and painting, where painting and sculpture, where sculpture and installation, where installation went back to drawing. And there was also sort of a sense of alchemy and magic that I was sort of, constantly driven by in the studio. So the first wall that you saw was about 12 feet. The second was 25 feet. 25. This is 36 feet, 25, and another 11. So the entire panel is about 110. The last 2 panels are the singing heads, and then the rest are just sort of this choreographed movement in space. So historically, a multiplicity of references are, I use the Baroque, the monochrome painting, minimalism, spiritual abstraction, Indian miniature paintings, Hollywood posters. And it wasn't so much that I, was trying to make a pastiche of these various traditions. It was, for me, a way to try and create something fresh and new. It was really about trying to put together, like make graft something that had a new, fresh voice, where certain expectations broke down and new ones emerged, or certain logic systems broke down and new ones emerged. So for me, I think that the drive to this notion of hybridity was more one of rejuvenation, maybe bringing life back to a tradition that's fairly old. Buddhist temple sculpture and Buddhist paintings have also played a big influence in some of this early work. I didn't realize it actually at the time when I was making the work, but as time went by, I thought about this idea of internally excavating, going inward in this sort of process of self-knowing or self-realization. And all the caves are basically this burrowing of space inward, literally and philosophically. And I think a lot of my relief sculpture comes from this notion of not just burrowing in one direction, but burrowing in both directions. So the idea of a force, etching or pushing out in one direction and another force pushing out in the other, the two kind of meet on this really thin membrane, if you will, and creates illusion, space, depth, narrative. I think that's kind of like, those were some of sort of the primary ideas that were driving my work at the time. Can you see this? The later work is much easier to see, so bear with me. Yes, please.
So the relief, part of it is created by, is there a sculptural element?
No, it's actually all free-form drawn. I make a padding, like a blanket, and I put the material down, and I scribe into it. It's like an invisible drawing in one direction, and I flip the surface over and make another drawing in the other direction. And the two drawings kind of oppose each other, if you will, or complement each other, maybe, and create the relief. I use a metal tool that you use to etch metal plates. Yeah. So the line, that's something I wasn't aware of when I was making this work. The line is such an integral part to the way I think, the way I make, even the way I paint is like drawing. It's like draw painting or paint drawing. It's something in between. Even the later work, as you will see, it's the accumulation of line that creates space. It's the accumulation of line that creates volume. It's the accumulation of line that creates whatever, rhythm. So line was not only, I mean, now that I'm looking at the work, was a way to sort of delineate the figural or the figurative elements of the body, my body. But the entire piece was like a linear, circular streak, if you will. So when you walked into the space, I felt like it was this monochromatic landscape that went transitioning across the spectrum, and then as you walked up, it revealed itself, and it constantly sort of emerged very slowly. So part of the reason I had this piece filmed as a moving image was because it was fairly immersive, large, experiential, and it was really impossible to try and capture that through still images. This room was all vertical columns, and the other room was a horizontal stripe. So again, the two polarities of the body and the landscape were kind of aspects, or the two kind of orientations that the work kept going back and forth between for a few years. And this is another sort of motif, mark, shape that has come up, and at the time I was interested because they were organic and geometric. They were like cuts, like eyes, like leaves. There was something really joyful and painful about them to me. And it's now or later on, as I thought about them in terms of this idea of two complementary forces, meeting up on a surface, they're like Venn diagrams. The circles, when they intersect, you get the intersection or the liminal space, which are those eyes, cuts, leaves. And so they really became a residue of that idea the sort of two forces thrust up against each other to create space. So these were basically just vertical portraits of me, of my body, standing and sort of in the middle of this sort of cascading shower of cuts, leaves, eyes.
How long did it take you to work on one piece?
I'm going to go to the slides now. This piece, 1 year. It's funny because I got kicked out of the studio that I had in downtown LA because the landlord was redeveloping for condos, and I lived in a studio apartment. So I kind of put two tables next to each other, so they were 8 feet long. No, 16 feet long. And I had a bed on the other side, and I basically rolled out of bed to work and rolled back out of work back to bed. And it was, I saw the work in increments of 16 feet at the most, horizontally, but when it went on the wall, I would see them in increments of 9 feet. And it was really an interesting experience for me to sort of envision what it might look like and what the experience might be afterwards, because there was no way of knowing. I had envisioned that every break in the room, every corner would be like a passage into another passage of music, and so it kept the tempo, the rhythm, the frequency shifted as you went from one wall to the next. So I really thought of those 5 walls as segments of music and orchestrated the bodies in a way that they moved in and out, the color relationships, as well as the, how close the bodies were and what kind of motifs appeared. Okay, so now I have a bunch of slides. Let me see here. Okay, this was a piece that I did for the Hammer Museum. I wanted to do something in the corner for a long time, and I made a piece that was like outstretched arms. I thought of it as a human figure reaching out to give you an embrace. I painted, the pieces were on duraline again. They were, I think, 3 feet tall, 7 feet long, so they were a total of 14 feet, the corner. They were painted in acrylic and etched, so there was no pencil. It was just relief, basically. So, the material is really, really thin. It's like 0.003 millimeters, and it's basically the slight fracture of the plane, which is creating it either to get light or to get dark. And it's the layering of one on the next, so it's like, you get a light plus a light gives you lighter, and there's a limit up to which you can make something push forward or go back. A dark on a darker can get dark only so far, and a light on a dark gives you these intermediate values. So it was sort of this amazing experience for me to try and create space with so little and with just one mark in one direction and the other on the other, and with each just these thrusting forces, basically. It was like a shimmering pool of water. I was also interested in this piece. In most pieces, they were matte. The pieces did not reflect, and so you had a different kind of physical experience with the work. In this one, I actually painted it silver, so not only was there a light and dark happening because of shadow, but there was also a reflective quality that happened when the viewer stood in the middle, went into the corner. So it was this almost like a blinding, almost like, there were moments when you couldn't really see because it was just shiny.
That's layers of Duolingo?
I'm sorry?
That's layers, or is that just
One layer. It's just one sheet. All these are one sheet. They're like super thin sheets that are just etched in both directions. The next piece I'm going to show you is the last piece in which I actually used my body, used the figure in a way. I was invited by the Pomona College Museum of Art to do an exhibition in their project space. And the project space was pretty cool and pretty funky because it had a black, shiny floor. you know, so that was the full room, and I decided that I wanted to do a piece that was really sculptural, that was very cinematic, that was very experiential, and most importantly, that utilized the floor. Because again, I had started to get really interested in how, I was getting interested in the relationship of the pictorial window to architecture and how that window could get extended and extended and extended. So it was really, for me, about creating as expansive an experience as possible. So I made a piece that was 19 feet wide and about 10 feet tall in 6 vertical columns. So this were reminiscent of Asian scroll paintings, Japanese and Chinese landscape paintings. So there were basically 6 scrolls that were stacked next to each other. And for me, really, one of the things that drove this was the reflection on the floor, and I wanted to see how that would affect the experience of the piece. So these are, can you see these a little bit better? Acrylic ink painted on the back side of the piece, color pencil drawn on the front side, and then the etching. So basically the idea, there was a horizon line that formed where the mountain met the floor, where the wall met the floor, and then there was another horizon line where the bodies were sort of bisecting or intersecting the plane of the mountain. So we had multiple horizon lines. And I kept it very sort of binary. I used complements. It was basically purple and yellow. The entire shape of the mountain I transcribed laterally across, so it went left and right. And so the marks that you see that are etched are basically the silhouette of the mountain that have been laterally shifted to the left and slightly shifted to the right. And as a result of that shifting, you've got these sort of cracks, fissures, or crevices that are created out of which some of these bodies seem like they're coming out.
Are they always figures of yourself? Are they lots of different people?
Just me. I used to have a friend come in to my studio. I would get naked and then jump up and down on the tables and stools and ladders and you know, sort of get these pictures that were totally, you know, subject to gravity, and then I'd try to sort of present them or represent them as being floating, or, you know, sort of defying that gravity. So there was something really liberating about achieving that state. And then there was also kind of a sense of loss, of losing place, of not knowing where one was. So that was the piece that I did at the museum using my body. And at that point, it sort of, it became kind of clearer to me that the entire work, piece, drawing, painting was becoming figurative, and then the bodies themselves were becoming a redundancy for me. I was also getting facile in terms of drawing, and it wasn't that interesting to me. And so that was the last piece in which I used my body. So now I'm going to, I'm sorry. Sorry. Okay. Uh-oh. I have these next couple of pieces with figures in front just for the, they're not, you know, the person is not of importance or interest, and I'm not going to talk about the person, just for scale reference. Continuing on, we were talking about this, Kim was briefly talking to me in the car about this idea of abstraction from other places, other locations, other cultures, and I guess because of my multicultural porous existence, having lived half my life in India and half in the United States, and because my education is in the sciences and in the arts, and for all kinds of reasons, I'm sort of interested in looking for answers or questions in many, many different places and many different sources. So some of the geometries that I was using to create pictorial space in the figurative work kind of emerged full force in the abstract work, because the idea was the viewer was now the subject. So the viewer was moving through these spaces that I was making for the viewer. So I was not there as a subject to direct the viewer or to create any kind of narrative. You created your own space, your own experience, your own narrative. I was just there to provide the spatial sort of conduit. So spirals and starbursts, I don't know what else to call them. Basically line, I mean, again, this idea of lines started coming back. So horizontal lines as in horizons, undulating lines as in mountains and valleys, spiraling and circling lines as in expansions and contractions, and perspectival lines as in starbursts. These sort of motifs have been continuously repeating in my work for the last 4 years. And this is the first big example of that work I made for my first show at Sister Gallery, which I had in 2005. I made work that was, again, very specific to the gallery. The entire length of the piece was the length of the gallery. The gallery was a narrow space and a very tall space, so I wanted it to be experienced not just from the ground, but from above, because you could go up to like a balcony level and look at it, and you could get a really great sense of the topography, of the sculptural component of the piece. So I think the gallery was like 13 feet wide or something like that, something really ridiculously narrow. So this image is actually at another venue. That's in my studio. So these paintings were made with acrylic ink. They were responses to every panel. Every successive panel was a response to the one prior to it, and they were basically a spiral expansion or contraction that met up with a perspectival expansion or contraction, and that's sort of the edge where those two came together. Then I was invited to do a piece for a show called Symmetry at the Mack Center. The Mack Center is a Center for Art and Architecture in West Hollywood. It's actually an Austrian museum. There's one in Vienna and one in Los Angeles, and this is the house where R.M. Schindler lived, the architect who also designed the house. It's really an amazing space for me because it is both incredibly oppressive and incredibly liberating at the same time. There's something really paradoxical about that space for me. It's very austere and very, what's the word? What's the opposite or the other side of austere? Baroque. At the same time, it's basically, if you go above the house and you look at it, it's sitting on this amazing property that's an incredibly lush garden. It's a radial symmetry. The axes sort of extend out, but you don't see the geometry from when you're inside the house. You can only see it once you're above the terrace, and even that not very well. My experience what was that it's really an incredibly sensual and tactile space because of the materials used and the spareness of the materials, but it's also an incredibly oppressive space because of the same reasons. The windows are slits, and you see the garden through these slit windows, and there's a psychological need to sort of kind of go out and bring the outside in. So there was this idea of wanting to escape and embrace at the same time the space. So I decided to make a piece that fit exactly in Pauline Schindler's studio. This was her studio at one time, and create this membrane that made the outside and the inside porous. These are also acrylic ink on duraline. So that's basically the view of the foliage in the garden that's outside, and that's sort of almost connecting with what's inside. Let me just say one other thing. The other interesting thing that started to happen is, like, a lot of the marks that were happening, say, for example, in this piece, although the representation of my figure was not in the work, the index of my body became more and more evident in the work. So all the little dotted, dashy marks are basically the jerk of my hand trying to stay steady as it moved along continuously and smoothly in as perfect a spiral or circle as I could. The marks of these guys here, they're basically blown. So I'm dropping the ink on the edges and then blowing them so they feel like they're sort of really oozing. So there's a trace of the body through breath. There's a trace of the body through literally the movement of it. So it's something that I started to pay attention to and to see how I could maybe extend that idea of the index of the body being present in the work in a different kind of way. These are what I have, I think, a series of mountains, valleys, horizons, spirals, and then two more site-sensitive pieces that I made. And I call them sensitive because I'm interested in the idea that for me, to make a work that's really sensitive to the location, the place, but I'm also very interested in taking that piece and then moving it elsewhere and see what else it can do. So it's not lodged to a mother site per se. It's kind of like my own experience as an immigrant or as a diasporic subject. For me, it's about constantly reinventing and recreating and seeing what that experience is like. So it's sort of this idea of flux that's very interesting and appealing to me. The black area of the mountains are etched. The black is actually fluid acrylic, and the rest of it is acrylic ink. I'm just going to go through a few images, then I want to talk about one other thing that I think is important in terms of what I've been thinking about these last bodies of work, which are this exploration of the line in these various permutations. This piece is 5 by 9 feet, so it's pretty large.
Is it still Duralard?
Duraline.
Duralard.
This is a smaller work, 2 by 3 feet, 2 by 3 feet, 2 by 3 feet, 2 by 3 feet, 18 by 24 inches. This was a mountain with a tail. It had a spill. White mountains. Yes.
With all of these and also with the one in the tail, do you have an idea of what you're going to make before you make it, or you just start something?
I know it's going to be a mountain form, but beyond that, no. It's pretty much, all the abstract works are pretty much improvised and done as I'm making I'm completely in the process of making them. They're not planned out at all. Very different from the figurative works where the body's said to be photographed and then drawn and then figured out to scale and then positioned and placed and all of that. So it's been an interesting shift. These are valleys. Something else that I wanted to talk about was, because my background is to some degree in science, and I am by no means an expert in physics, but I've been very, very interested in physics and cosmology. So light, gravity, speed of light, the cone of light, the event horizon. These ideas are absolutely amazing and inspiring to me. One of the things that I find, or I use as a model for myself in a weird way, analogous way, is this idea of light as having a complementary nature, which is that it is both a particle and a wave at the same time, and there's no oppositionality. It's just perfectly coexisting. To me, that becomes this really amazing, for me, it becomes this amazing model where the particle, if you know the particle or where the particle is positioned, you don't know the frequency of the wave. Or if you know the frequency of the wave, you don't really know where the position of the particle is. So in a weird way, it becomes this problem of creating knowledge from experience and evidence, that gap between the two, which is kind of what the work is trying to do, is sort of use language, but then sort of go out of that language so it becomes unverifiable to some degree. So I just wanted to bring that up because that nature of complementarity, I think, is really kind of really an interesting core that I keep going back to. Two by 3 feet. 2 by 3 feet. Am I giving enough time with the pauses with the images? 2 by 3 feet. Huh? No light behind them, not yet. There's a piece that's going to come with light behind them, but not these.
What influences color?
I set up real simple structures for myself. Like a lot of times they're binaries and systems of 3s and 4s. So this one was a complete binary system, orange and black. They started out with a stripe painting. The top half was basically an abstract stripe painting, coming from a very different tradition of abstract painting. And then the idea was to take that very specific Western modernist motif and then deform it, transform it. So it was basically black and orange stripes going in a V, kind of like a Frank Stella painting. And then I kind of went and kind of messed around with it, and that's what happened to it. This one was like a Yayoi Kusama dot painting. It started off, so there's specific things that generate certain kinds of conversations for myself. So that was like a dot, very sort of repetitive, obsessive kind of work. Then I sort of went in and started to deform it, transform it, so it became something. So basically use that as a point of departure. I think all of these are binaries, all binary systems. Something that they said you should never do in school. I was like, I'm going to do all binaries. I'm going to make it non-binary through binary. I'm going to try. Orange and black. Black and white. White and white. Oh, now we're going to do a series of horizons. One more thing I wanted to say about the line is that, and I just remembered, is that the edge where spaces come together, which seems like a contiguous finite edge, actually encompasses infinity. Again, going back to this idea of infinite space. And so part of the drive for this recent work has been to create infinite, sort of the sense of infinite space in these pictorials. So. In the valleys, the mountains, the horizons, all of these motifs, that notion of the two coming together, actually touching, but actually being an infinite amount of possibilities or infinite amount of permutations is sort of kind of an interesting one for me. These are all horizons, again, two binary. I decide at a certain point, basically the only decision I make is where the horizontal line is going to go. And one side's going to be black and the other side's going to be ink color. And for me, they become very invested in a certain kind of process of making the painting. So they're improvised and relational to the process. And then it's also kind of that tension between where process and image come together, and it's neither one or the other, but both simultaneously. These are all 4 by 5 feet. So these are larger. This is 3 by 6 feet, maybe. 4 by 5 feet. The process, the dripping and folding or etching the bottom and the two coming together, both as two processes in making an image. So this is where the air is going as far as blowing the paint. So the piece that I did for the Max Center where I blew, there was a pretty mellow kind of blowing. And then I really wanted to get crazy with the blowing, and I don't have the lung capacity, so I got myself an air compressor. So I've been making these with air.
Is it ink?
Ink, acrylic ink on Durolene blown. This is 2 by 3 feet.
Are you manipulating the paint more than the air?
Nothing, it's just air. Yeah, there's a really delicate tension there where you can really tell it's processed in some places, and in some places it really looks like a representation of something, and it's like not really knowing which one it is. This one is also blown and etched, and this is also a blown drawing. 2 by 3 feet. This is a reverse of that image, done with white ink on black gessoed paper, a duraline, I mean. This is a large piece, 5 by 8 feet. The detail, 4 by 5 feet. 4 by 5 feet.
That's the wood shop.
Shut up with your horizons! Be quiet!
No science.
I forgot what I was saying. Okay, the horizons. It's interesting talking about abstract painting. It's hard. We're going into spirals. Again, expansion, contraction, this idea of space and time, not as a grid, as an alternative to the grid. Five by 8 feet, this piece. Something else about the process. All of this is an additive process, and this is all removable. So they go back and forth between layers and layers and layers and remove on the duraline. This is 5 by 14 feet. It's pretty large. There's some, so there's that, the hand, the circular, the index of the mark of the body, and then there's some of the blowing happening at the same time.
Did you think about intention and no intention?
Exactly.
So the light play then is a product of subtractive wiping away back to the
Exactly.
the surface itself.
Yes, there is some light play that happens in the additive, and then there's extreme light play in the subtraction.
Are you using water-based ink?
Yes. I'm using this really great FW ink, which is a British, I think, ink. And it's water resistant, it's resistant to the sun, it's non-fugitive, it's really amazing permanence, but Windex will get to it. So I've been using brushes, Q-tips, Windex, some alcohol can work, but so I've been using these alternative ways to alchemically transform and manipulate the medium.
Are you getting help making the circles? Or is
No, they're just freehand. They're not circles, they're actually spirals. So they start out, they're all freehand. And yeah, exactly.
Pretty straight circles.
They're completely flawed. But when you make a mistake over and over and again, they start to look like perfection. I'm serious.
Are you still working flat?
Flat. A lot of this is done on the wall because it's, so it's sort of kind of keeping my hand moving and my body engaged. And then these marks are done on the floor because it's the puddling of the Windex with the paint. Some of it gets pulled away and some of it just gets moved. So it's kind of a removal and a transformation. Yes? Okay, so these last two, no, actually there's three more bodies of work. Are we okay on time? It'll be quick. I made a 3-part panel for a show at Pitzer Gallery last year. It's a really tall, white space, really like these really thin slit windows going up all the way. It's very light, it's a luminous space, and it's very vertically oriented. So I wanted to make a piece that was really dark and horizontally oriented just to see what kind of balance it would do. This is 15 feet by 5 feet. Ink, black gesso, Windex. Huh?
Materials? Do you list it?
I don't. I should, huh?
No, keep it a secret. We don't tell anybody.
So do you buy the Duralene in rolls?
I do buy the Duralene rolls. I love the Duralene because it has so many intrinsic properties that are sort of connected at a core level to my work. It's got the sort of luminosity that I seek. It's got the possibility of opacity that I can, I can use. It has that, the thing about oil painting that I love so much is the sort of luminosity that you get. And in a weird way, it starts out from that point here. It's got the luminosity because it's translucent. And so I can use a water-based, non-toxic material to work with. Yes?
I just want to ask you about your, sort of the larger forms that happen. And if you, like, just on any piece, like the division between, say, the land, let's call it, and maybe the sky, or whatever, does that happen, like, through a line, or is it through an accumulation?
Accumulation.
Okay. As it determines the shapes?
Exactly. They're basically, as I said earlier, like it's the addition of discrete line that ultimately ends up making space and volume and light. So it's all of these are basically like strands of strokes. They're all, successive strokes that create the shape. So that was the piece that I did at Pitzer. This is the first piece that I did where I actually used light. So it functioned like a stained glass window. I was invited to do the show in New Delhi at a Nature Mort Gallery. Peter Nagy had this really incredible space designed by preeminent architect Charles Correa. It was a private residence, it was a courtyard residence, which was very appropriate because it had this sort of centrifugal, centripetal sort of structure to begin with. And I went there and I saw that window. It was overlooking a courtyard that had a garden below. It had these beautiful, plants that were creeping up on the two sides opposite the window. So I decided to make a piece for the window. It was up for 2 months in the sun. There was no fading. It was amazing. That's what it looked like from the outside. There was a cut right in the middle of the piece, sort of an homage to Barnett Newman, but also a relationship to the actual environment, the surroundings. There were like these creepers that were out on the other side of it. So I just wanted to make a relationship between the actual plant form and the abstract form in the painting.
Was this the first show in India?
First show in India.
How did it feel?
It was amazing. My mother was there. She looked amazing. She was like, "What is this now? What do you do? Wow, what is this?" So that was during the daytime, and it was really kind of cool because, all these architectural things would sort of become part of the piece. There would be a piece of leaf that would just kind of sit on the ledge and it would become a shape that would become. So there was this really nice temporal organic quality to the work because it shifted so much. So part of it was just the challenge of letting go. It is what it is, and it'll do its own thing. The other thing that was happening was because there was wind, it was like, there was every now and then it would flutter. So there was almost like bubbling and fluttering, and sometimes it was static. So it had this really interesting presence, I think. 2 colors, binary systems again, orange and black, that's it. I was from the inside. That's the detail. These were 2 small works I did for the wall in an adjacent gallery, just as wall works.
Black gesso on Duralene.
Black gesso and Duralene, and then white ink along with the compressor.
You etching these at all, or?
No etching, nothing. Okay, so this is the last body of work I want to show, and I want to show this because it's for the first time, I think it was, like you're making work in your studio and you're exploring different vectors in different directions, and there is a tendency, or at least a modernist tendency, where the work has to follow a very sequential, very focused, very narrow sort of serial thing. It has to be about this one thing, and it has to go deep, and it has to sort of extrapolate out. Well, this is not what this show was about for me. It was really liberating. I was like, this is what I'm doing, and this is what I'm going to show. And so there was this interesting crosstalk conversation going on about studio practice in this way, which wasn't about a modernist model of what an exhibition or what a painting exhibition should be about. So it's got a lot of different things. But this is a space in Chinatown called Cottage Home, which used to be a theater, which is now a gallery. And it's huge, it's cavernous, there's this amazing box, it goes really tall, and I wanted to hang the work in a way that there was enough room around the work, and also to create the sense of, this sense of drama that happens when you're in a theater looking at a film. So there's a bunch of installation shots, and then there's details. So that'll give you a sense. Are these getting weirdly compressed? Maybe they are, I can't tell. Sometimes, the screens.
I don't think so.
No? Because my screen looks very different.
Well, it's like convexity.
Anyway, that piece is 15 feet long and 5 feet tall, so that'll just give you a sense of scale. This is 9 feet tall and 5 feet wide.
No people on this.
I know, I should have had some. Thank you. Will be corrected for the next one. Now, detailed shots of the works themselves.
So are these pinned up?
Yeah, taped and pinned. White tape that almost completely disappears with the wall, so they really become invisible. So they function as windows more than objects.
Do you ever etch and paint the same?
I'm sorry?
Do you ever etch and paint on the same area, or is it separate?
If I do, the area is a monochrome color. Otherwise, it turns into mud. You don't see anything. So there was a two-part exhibition, one in Cottage Home and one in Sister, and this is the sister location of the same show. So for that, I installed the pieces almost vertically, almost like in a sort of filmic, cinematic kind of orientation, so they really felt like experimental film because they were using so much of the filmic properties of material. It's like plastic, so it sort of made sense to show the work and to think about the painting in terms of film more. That piece, again, had the same problem that the 5-panel piece was, which is that I couldn't walk back far enough to get the whole image. So there, it's at an angle because the gallery was only 14 feet or whatever it was deep. That's a studio shot. It's 5 feet by 15 feet.
On these ones, are you working on both sides?
No, just one side. Just one side. And for these ones, I really, I was trying so hard to not make it a thing, a landscape, or attach it to a thing, but yet give it a place, So I was like, I used the spiral, and then, I just thought of the spiral as expanding and contracting, and at very, very, very large expansions, a segment of the spiral would actually look like a straight line, horizontal. And then, depending on where you were, you could see sort of, the curvature sort of slowly diminishing. So for me, it was almost like that metonymic slide of things where you start to identify and signify, and then it kind of slides to something else and something else and something else and something else. And it's never a resting place or a stopping point. It's just continuous, infinite loop. And that's it.